Before we begin, drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching. Whether it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France, I want to know. Don't just sit back. Tell me where in the world you are. And before we dive into the story, my mom said we can't get to 1,000 subscribers. Can you help me prove her wrong? Go ahead and hit that subscribe button and be part of this journey. Let's show her what we can do. Now, let's dive into the story. The morning they auctioned her mother's piano, Della Voss stood in the mud with her 3 children pressed against her sides and did not cry. She had promised herself that much. She would not cry where Harlan Cree could see her. He stood near the back of the crowd in his brown wool coat, arms folded, watching the way a man watches something he already owns. The piano had belonged to Della's mother, Estelle, who had carried it by wagon from Missouri 30 years ago through a mountain pass that killed 2 mules and nearly killed her. It was rosewood. It had ivory keys yellowed at the edges like old teeth. And when the auctioneer's hammer came down for $9.40, Della felt something inside her chest go quiet in a way that was worse than pain. Her youngest, Birdie, was 6 years old and did not understand what an auction was. She only knew that men were touching her grandmother's piano. She asked Della why they were letting strangers carry it away. Della told her to hush. But her voice cracked when she said it, and Birdie heard the crack and pressed her small face into her mother's coat and breathed. The town of Caldwell Flats sat in a wide, flat valley between 2 ridges of pale stone, the kind of place where winter arrived early and stayed too long. By October, the wind off the northern ridge carried ice in it. By November, the creek froze hard enough to walk on. Della's husband, Royce Voss, had died in March. Not gloriously, not in battle, but from a lung fever that took him in 4 days while the children slept in the next room. He left behind a half-finished barn, a mule named Copper, $200 in debt to the Caldwell Flats Merchant Bank, and 3 children who still looked for his shadow in the doorway every evening at sundown. Della had spent the spring and summer fighting the debt quietly, selling garden produce, taking in mending, bartering eggs for flour. But the bank was not interested in quiet fighting. The bank was interested in money, and the man who ran it, Harlan Cree, was interested in Della's land. He had made that clear in a letter, and then in person, standing at her front door with his hat in his hand and a smile that never reached his eyes. Her oldest child was a boy named Cass, 12 years old, built, lean, and serious like his father. He did not speak much. He worked without being told to, chopping wood before dawn, checking the fence line after school, carrying water without complaint. When his father died, Cass had taken one afternoon to sit alone behind the barn, and Della had heard nothing from him, not a sound. But when he came back in for supper that evening, something in his face had settled into a hardness she recognized. It was the face of a person who has decided they cannot afford to fall apart. She had wanted to hold him. She had wanted to tell him he was still allowed to be a child. She hadn't found the words. Her middle child was a girl named Fern, 9 years old, with her father's eyes and a temper that ran hot and fast like a brush fire. Fern was the one who had screamed at the men carrying the piano. She had to be held back by Cass, her boots dragging furrows in the mud. After the auction, the crowd thinned slowly, the way crowds do when the entertainment is over and guilt begins to set in. A few women from the church passed Della without speaking. Mrs. Aldridge, who had been her neighbor for 6 years, turned her face away with the practiced ease of someone who had been practicing for weeks. Only old Burl Fenwick, who ran the feed store and smelled permanently of grain dust, stopped to touch the brim of his hat and say he was sorry. Della thanked him. She did not tell him that sorry did not feed children. She did not tell him that she had not slept more than 3 hours a night since Royce died, that she had been lying awake calculating and recalculating numbers that never came out right, that she had already sold her mother's silver brooch, her good riding saddle, and 2 quilts hand-stitched by her grandmother. She simply thanked him, collected her children, and walked back through the mud toward home. That night, when all 3 children were asleep, Birdie curled like a comma against Fern's back, Cass flat on his side with one arm hanging off his narrow cot. Della sat at the kitchen table with a candle and a sheet of paper. She wrote down everything she still owned. It did not take long. The list was short. At the bottom, she wrote the number the bank needed from her by the first day of December. Then she sat very still in the candle's small warm circle and looked at the gap between what she had and what she needed. It was not a small gap. It was a canyon. But Della Voss had been raised by a woman who dragged a piano through a mountain pass that killed 2 mules, and she came from that same blood. She folded the paper. She blew out the candle. And in the dark, she began to think. 3 days after Royce Voss was buried, a man named Pell Garvey rode out to the house with a leather satchel and a face like an undertaker. He was Royce's business partner in the loosest sense. The two had shared a small cattle operation for 2 years, buying lean stock cheap, grazing them through summer, selling them fat in fall. It had been a modest arrangement that made modest money, and Della had never paid it much attention. She had her garden, her preserves, her mending work. She had trusted Royce to manage the cattle side of things. That had been her first mistake, though she would not understand it until Pell Garvey sat down across from her at the kitchen table, opened his satchel, and showed her the papers. Royce, it turned out, had borrowed against his share of the operation 6 months before he died. He had borrowed against it quietly, without telling Della, and had used the money to pay off a gambling debt she had not known existed. The debt to the bank was not just a debt from doctor's bills and unpaid store credit. A large piece of it was this: a loan her husband had taken in secret, in her name, against the only business they had. Della read the papers twice. She read them a 3rd time. She had never been a woman given to dramatic displays, but she felt something in her shift, not collapse, but rearrange, like furniture shoved to one side to make room for something heavy. She asked Pell Garvey if these were legitimate. He said they were. She asked if Royce had signed them himself. He said yes. She asked if there was any way out of them. Pell looked at the table and said not that he could see. He had the grace, at least, to look ashamed. He had known Royce since they were young men. He had been to their wedding. He had held Cass as an infant. Now he was sitting across from Della Voss, telling her that the man she had built her life beside had left a hole in the floor she hadn't seen until she was already falling through it. After Pell left, Della went out to the barn and stood with Copper for a long time. The mule was old and warm and smelled of hay and sweat, and he allowed her to press her forehead against his neck without moving. This was more than most people in Caldwell Flats had offered her. She did not think about Royce with anger. Not yet. She thought about him the way you think about a man you loved truly, who was also imperfect truly, who made choices that were desperate and wrong and very human. She thought about the early years, before Cass was born, when they had nothing at all and it had felt like an adventure instead of a trap. She thought about how he used to hum when he worked, low and tuneless, and how she had never told him she loved that sound. The anger would come later. Right now, she needed to think clearly. What she had, the house and land, not yet repossessed. Copper the mule, a milk cow named Ruth, a kitchen garden that was dormant for winter, a sewing kit, 2 good needles, thread, 3 children in reasonably good health, Cass's labor, her own 2 hands, which were strong and had never failed her. What she needed, enough money by December 1st to satisfy the bank. Or at minimum, enough to make Harlan Cree believe she intended to satisfy it, which might buy her more time. She had spoken to 2 women in town who occasionally hired out sewing work. She had spoken to the hotel about laundry. The hotel paid 3 cents per item, which was insulting, but it was money. She had also heard through Burl Fenwick that the Carver Ranch 20 miles north was short a cook for the season. The pay was real, but it meant leaving the children, and she would not do that. She made her decision standing in the barn with her hand on Copper's neck. She would not wait for work to come to her. She would go to work. Every skill she had, every object she owned, every hour she could squeeze from the day, all of it was now a resource to be used. She would start tomorrow. She would start before sunrise. She would not ask Caldwell Flats for pity or permission. The town could think whatever it liked. The town had thought plenty about her already, she had noticed. The whispers after church, the looks when she bought credit at the store, the particular way certain women stepped back when she approached, as if poverty were catching. Fine. Let them watch. She would give them something worth watching. By the second week of November, Della had sold the following: her mother's second quilt, the blue one with the star pattern, for $1.50 to a woman in town who had admired it at a church supper 2 years before, and apparently still wanted it badly enough to pay. Her spare iron skillet, which had been a wedding gift, for 40 cents. A bolt of good wool fabric she had been saving for winter coats she had not yet made. A jar of her best blackberry preserves, and then 6 more jars, because the woman who bought the first one told her neighbor, and that neighbor told 2 more. Within 4 days, every jar she had put up over the summer was gone. She made a list of what she had earned. She made another list of what she needed. The gap was still wide, but it was slightly less wide than before, and that slight narrowing was enough to keep her moving. She had begun taking in laundry from the hotel and 2 boarding houses. This meant hauling water, heating it, scrubbing, wringing, hanging, pressing. She did it before the children woke and after they slept, by lamplight in the yard when the weather allowed, and by the kitchen fire when it did not. Her hands grew raw. The skin at her knuckles cracked and bled a little. She wrapped them in cloth strips at night and unwrapped them in the morning. Cass noticed. He offered to help. She told him to focus on school, which he was attending every day still, because she had decided early that whatever else she had to sacrifice, the children's schooling would not be on that list. Cass argued once. She won. He stopped arguing. Word had spread through Caldwell Flats, the way word always does in a small town, unevenly, with invention. What Della was actually doing was working with everything she had to keep her family alive through a hard winter. What the town said she was doing depended entirely on who was telling the story. Some people said she was selling off her home piece by piece like a woman with no sense. Some said she was foolish to stay in a house she couldn't afford. At the Mercantile, a woman named Velda Pratt, who had never worked a day that Della knew of, having married a man with a hardware business and considerable savings, said within earshot of Burl Fenwick that it was shameless, a widow woman pawning her things all over town instead of accepting help gracefully. Burl told Della later, quietly, with an apology built in. Della thanked him. She thought about Velda Pratt's word. Shameless. She turned it over. She decided it did not fit and set it down. Fern had started watching. That was what Della noticed. 9-year-old Fern, who ran hot and broke things when she was angry, had gone quiet in the past weeks. She followed Della with her eyes. She watched her mother fold laundry at midnight and write numbers on paper and stand in the yard, looking at the sky as if she was reading something up there. One evening, Fern said, out of nowhere, that she wanted to help. Della asked what she had in mind. Fern said she could collect eggs faster than Della, which was true, and that she had been practicing her mending stitches, which she showed by producing a small piece of cloth she had clearly been secretly stitching for days. The stitches were uneven, but close and determined. Della looked at them for a long moment. Then she pulled Fern against her side and pressed her lips to the top of her daughter's head and held her there. December 1st was 22 days away. She had raised $41 by rough count. Not enough, but real. She had a plan for the next 3 weeks that she was refining daily. More preserves from late root vegetables she could put up quickly, 2 more pieces of furniture she could bear to sell, a wool blanket she had finished knitting late the night before. Harlan Cree had sent a second letter. She had read it, noted the date, and placed it face down under the candle on the table, which was as much attention as she intended to give it. The letter said she had 3 weeks. She knew she had 3 weeks. What Harlan Cree did not know, what no one in Caldwell Flats knew yet, was that Della Voss had also made contact, through Burl Fenwick, with a cattle buyer from Abilene who passed through the valley twice a year. She had a proposition for him. She was waiting for his answer. It was Cass who first heard the talk at school. He came home one afternoon with mud on his boots and a stillness about him that Della recognized as the particular stillness of a person carrying something they haven't decided what to do with yet. She gave him time. She set supper on the table, beans and cornbread, the same as the past 4 nights, because beans were what she had. After Fern and Bertie were done and washing up, Cass stayed at the table with his hands folded in front of him and told her what the Pratt boy had said. Della listened without moving. The Pratt boy was 12, the same age as Cass, and had apparently repeated his mother's word in the schoolyard, with additions of his own. He had said Della Voss was selling everything because she couldn't manage without a man. He had said the Voss children would probably be split up to different households by spring because their mother was going to lose the house. He had said this in front of Cass, who had then hit him in the mouth and been kept after school by the teacher. Della looked at her son's still face across the table. She asked if he had broken the boy's nose. Cass said he didn't think so. She asked if the teacher had been hard on him. He said she had made him stay and clean the schoolroom floor, but had not sent a note home, and that she had said almost nothing to him, except that next time he should use his words. Della considered this. She thought the teacher was probably right. And she also thought that if she had been 12 and someone had said that about her mother in a schoolyard, she might have done the same thing. She told Cass both of these things. He looked surprised that she admitted the second part. She told him the Pratt boy was wrong on all counts, that the house was not lost yet, and that she needed him to trust her. He said he did. She believed him. Bertie was the hardest to manage in a different way. She was 6, and she felt everything at full volume. And she was old enough to sense that something was wrong, but too young to understand the shape of it. She had started waking at night, not crying, just waking, padding across the floor to Della's room and climbing into bed beside her and lying there with her small warm weight pressed against Della's back. Della never turned her away. Some nights she lay there listening to Bertie breathe, and she thought about her own mother, Estelle, who had crossed a mountain pass alone with a piano and no certainty of anything on the other side. She thought about what Estelle had said once, when Della was about Bertie's age, that the only thing a mother owes her, children, is the truth of who she is. Not perfection, not safety she can't guarantee. Just the true shape of herself, given honestly. She had not understood it then. She understood it now. Fern had taken over the egg collecting entirely, and was doing it with a precision that bordered on competitive. She kept a small notebook, the back pages of a school exercise book she had finished, where she recorded the number each day. She was also, Della discovered, haggling. She had approached old Burl Fenwick about selling eggs directly through the feed store, rather than going through the mercantile, where the markup went to someone else. Burl had agreed. Fern reported this to Della at supper, as though it were a minor errand she had run. Della stared at her 9-year-old daughter across the beans and cornbread, and felt something move through her that she could not name exactly. It was pride, but it was also grief. Grief that her child should be thinking this way, should have to think this way, should already know at 9 that money doesn't come. It has to be made. That night, after all 3 children slept, Della took out her list. She added Fern's egg income. She added the wool blanket she would sell Thursday. She added the amount she expected from the laundry work by end of week. She added the estimate Burl had given her about the cattle buyer's interest. The total was closer. Not there, not yet, but closer, and in the margin of the paper, without really meaning to. She wrote a small word and underlined it once. The word was enough. Not as a fact yet, as a direction, a fixed point in the dark to walk toward. She folded the paper. She blew out the lamp. Outside, the wind off the northern ridge was sharp and cold, and snow was beginning to come down in the thin, dry flakes that meant a serious winter was setting in. She listened to it tap against the window. Then she turned on her side and slept 3.5 hours, which was more than usual, which felt like a victory. His name was Aldous Peck, and he arrived on a Tuesday in a buckboard pulled by 2 gray horses. Wearing a coat that had seen better decades and a hat with a brim so wide it threw shadow over half his face even in winter light. He was 60-something, with hands like old rope and eyes that were quick and honest in a way that Della noticed immediately. Because honesty in a business dealing in Caldwell Flats was unusual enough to be worth noting. Burl Fenwick had vouched for him. That was sufficient. She met him at the fence line because she did not want him in the house where the children could hear a negotiation that might go badly. Cass watched from the barn doorway. She had not told him to stay there. He had decided on his own. Della's proposition was this: Copper, the mule. He was old, she said, but sound. Still strong enough for a full season's work. She knew what old mules sold for, and she was not going to insult either of them by pretending she didn't. She wanted fair market value, not charity, and she wanted it in coin, not credit. Aldous Peck walked around Copper twice, checked his teeth, ran his hands down his legs, asked 2 questions about his temperament, and then named a price. It was fair. It was actually $1 above what she had estimated. She did not let her face show what that meant to her. She said she would take it. They shook hands. He counted out the coins from a worn leather pouch, and she counted them after him without apology. Because this was business, and she was a businesswoman, whether Caldwell Flats had decided to acknowledge it yet or not. After Peck's buckboard rolled back down the road toward town, Della stood with the coins in her hand, and Copper watching her from across the fence with his large brown eyes, which were not accusing and not forgiving. They were simply the eyes of a mule who had no opinion about money. She had spent 6 years with that animal. He had been Royce's before he was hers, and he had been a wedding gift from Royce's father. And he was the last living thing she owned that connected directly to the life she had before Royce died. She let herself feel that for exactly as long as it took to breathe in and breathe out. Then she turned and walked back to the house. She had 17 days left. The addition of copper's sale price changed the numbers significantly. She was now within striking distance, not of the full amount, but of enough to make an offer Harlan Cree might actually consider. She had been studying Cree all fall, the way you study a man you can't trust. Carefully, from a distance, noting his patterns. He was a businessman before he was a cruel one, she believed. He wanted the land, yes. But what he wanted more, what all men like him wanted, was to be seen as powerful and reasonable at the same time. A partial payment with a credible plan for the rest was more useful to his reputation than a repossession. Repossessions made enemies. She was going to walk into his office on the last day of November, not December 1st, but the day before, to show she wasn't scrambling. And she was going to make him an offer he could say yes to in front of other people without looking like a monster. She had thought about this carefully. She thought it could work. What she had not planned for was what happened at the schoolhouse on Wednesday, 2 days after the mule sale. She was hanging laundry in the yard when Cass came running. Not walking fast, running. She dropped the sheet. She met him at the gate. His face was not panicked. It was something harder and more complicated. He told her that the teacher, Miss Aldrin, had sent him home with a message. And the message was that Mrs. Pratt, Velda Pratt, the woman who had called her Shameless, had gone to the school board and reported that the Voss children were being neglected, that they came to school without adequate clothing in cold weather, that their mother was too preoccupied with selling her household to feed them properly, that the board had been asked to consider whether the children should be assessed. Della stood at her gate in the cold air with a damp sheet in one hand and listened to her 12-year-old son say these words. Then she asked him, very quietly, whether Miss Aldrin had seemed to believe any of it. Cass said no. He said Miss Aldrin had given him the message, in a tone that made it clear she was delivering it out of obligation and nothing else. That helped. A little. But not enough. Della went to see Velda Pratt the next morning. She did not go in anger. Anger was not a tool she could afford right now. She went in the gray early morning before most of the town was awake, and she knocked on the door of the Pratt house, which was large and well kept and had curtains in every window. And she waited. Velda Pratt answered in a house robe, saw who it was, and for a brief moment, something uncertain moved across her face. Then it hardened into the expression she had been wearing all fall when she looked at Della. The careful distance of a woman who has decided another woman's suffering is a moral failing rather than a circumstance. Della asked if she could come in. Velda said she supposed so. They sat in the parlor, which smelled of cedar and something warm on the stove. And Della looked at Velda Pratt squarely across the tea table and said what she had come to say. She said she knew Velda had spoken to the school board. She said she was not there to threaten or beg. She said she was there to tell Velda directly that her children were fed, clothed, and attended school every day, and that whatever Velda believed about how a widow woman ought to behave, her children had done nothing to deserve the attention of a school board inquiry. She said this without raising her voice. She said it looking Velda in the eye the whole time. Velda opened her mouth twice without speaking. Then she said that she was only concerned, that it was nothing personal, that anyone could see Della was struggling and the children might be better placed. Della stopped her there, She said the children were placed. They were placed with their mother. Velda Pratt was not a wicked woman. That was the complicated truth of it. She was a woman who had never been frightened, not really, not the way Della had been frightened this year. And she had the particular cruelty of people who have never been frightened. The cruelty of easy judgment. She had looked at Della selling quilts and laundry and a mule and seen disarray, seen a woman coming apart, because she had no frame of reference for what holding together looked like when you had nothing. Her world was a world where a woman's stability was expressed by what she kept. She did not know how to read a woman whose stability was expressed by what she was willing to let go. Della did not explain this to her. She simply stood, thanked her for the tea she had not been, offered, and left. But something had shifted. Della could feel it as she walked back down the main street of Caldwell Flats in the early morning light. She was tired in a way that went past the body. Tired of being watched, tired of being interpreted, tired of having her survival read as spectacle. She passed the mercantile. Closed still, shutters drawn. She passed the bank. Harlan Cree's domain, the building she had been negotiating against in her head for 8 months. She stopped and looked at it for a moment. 2 stories. Good stone foundation. He had done well for himself, Harlan Cree. He had done well because this town needed a bank, and he had had the money to start one and the disposition to run it without mercy. She thought about the meeting she had planned. She thought about her offer. She thought about the numbers she had calculated, coin by coin, over weeks of raw-handed work. Then she walked home. That afternoon, Fern found her at the kitchen table and asked her why. She looked the way she looked. Della asked what way she looked. Fern said like a person who was done being bothered. Della considered this. She said that was approximately correct. Fern nodded with the gravity of a person twice her age and went back to her egg notebook. Birdie, from the corner where she was arranging small stones she had collected into patterns only she understood, said without looking up that Mama always smelled like soap. Della asked if that was a good thing. Birdie said yes. It meant she was working, and working meant they would be okay. Della sat with that for a long moment. Her 6-year-old daughter, assembling her own small theology of safety from laundry soap and her mother's hands. She added up the numbers again that evening. She was close. She was very close. She needed one more thing. Something she had been holding in reserve, something she had not wanted to use. But she was close enough now that she could see the other side. 14 days left. One more source of income. One meeting with Harlan Cree. She made a decision. She would sell the last thing on her list. She would sell it tomorrow, quietly, without fanfare, the way she had sold everything else. And then she would walk into that bank and she would settle this. The last thing on the list was her wedding ring. She had known it was there all along. She had placed it last not because it was most valuable. It was not. It was a plain gold band worth perhaps $4 or $5. But because it was the thing she had been least willing to reach for. Partly because of what it meant to her, and partly, if she was being honest, because of what people would say. A widow selling her wedding ring was, in the calculus of Caldwell Flats, a different kind of statement than a widow selling a quilt or a mule. It would be noticed. It would be talked about. It would be assigned meaning she did not intend. She sat with the ring in her palm for a while after she took it off. She sat at the kitchen table before the children were up, in the gray, cold morning light, and she turned it over. She thought about the day Royce had put it on her finger. She thought about how young she had been. She thought about the secret debt, the signed papers, the loans she hadn't known about. And she thought, with some difficulty, about how she had made peace with that. Not forgiven, not entirely, but laid down. Royce had been afraid, and he had made a bad decision from fear, and it had fallen on her to carry it, and she had carried it. She thought this was true of many women. She thought it was probably true of most women, in most towns, in most centuries, the carrying of consequences from fear they had not made. Then she put the ring in her coat pocket and walked to Burl Fenwick's store when it opened. Burl was unlocking the door when she arrived. He looked at her face and then at her left hand, and she saw him understand, without her saying it. He did not say anything dramatic. He said, "Come in, have coffee first." She sat with him at the small table near the stove, where he kept a pot going all winter for customers, and they drank coffee without talking about the ring for a few minutes, which was a kindness she registered and filed away for later gratitude. Then he asked what she needed for it. She told him. He said he knew a man in Wichita who bought gold, that he could send word and have a payment back within the week. She said she needed it faster than that. He looked at her, and then reached under the counter, counted out coins, and laid them on the table. He said consider it a sale, not a loan, and that he would send the ring to Wichita himself and keep whatever the man in Wichita paid. She did the math quickly. She said that was more than fair. He shrugged and said he had been in business for 30 years and had never managed to feel good about a woman selling her wedding ring. And this was the closest thing to feeling good about it that he could manage. She walked home with the coins in her pocket and the ring gone from her finger and the strange, light sensation of a person who has crossed a line they cannot uncross and found, unexpectedly, that the ground on the other side is solid. Cass was chopping wood when she came through the gate. He looked at her left hand. He was 12 years old, and he saw it. He held her gaze for a moment, then went back to chopping. She went inside and added the coins to her total. She sat down and wrote out the full number. She read it twice. She was there. She had done it. Not the full debt. She had never been going to have the full debt, and she had known that from the beginning. But she had the amount she needed for the offer she intended to make. She had run the numbers, and she had studied Harlan Cree, and she had a plan. Tomorrow was the last day of November. Tomorrow she was going to the bank. Fern and Bertie came home from school at midday. It was a half day, some kind of occasion Della had forgotten. And they found their mother standing at the stove making something that smelled different from beans. Fern stopped in the doorway. She asked what was in the pot. Della told her it was venison stew, that old Burl Fenwick had given her a cut of venison from the deer his son had brought in last week. Bertie pushed past Fern and came and pressed her face against Della's coat and breathed. Della put her hand on her daughter's head. Fern came to the other side and stood there without saying anything. Cass came in from the wood pile and stamped his boots and saw his mother at the stove flanked by his sisters, and the stew smell filled the small kitchen, and the wind hit the windows from outside with a sound like a brushed drum. He took off his coat. He sat down. He said it smelled good. Della said it would be ready in an hour. Della woke before 4 on the last day of November. She lay still for a moment, feeling the dark and the cold and the particular weight of a day that mattered. She could hear Bertie's slow breath beside her. The child had come in again in the night, silently, like a small warm tide. She could hear the wind. She could hear, very faintly, Cass moving in his room, which meant he was awake too, which meant he knew what today was, which meant he had been lying awake thinking about it, which meant she had a 12-year-old boy carrying more than a 12-year-old boy should have to carry, which was a thought she placed carefully to the side because if she let herself feel the full weight of it right now, she would not be useful. She dressed in the dark. She put on the good dress, the navy one, the one she wore to church before church had become complicated, the one that was clean and pressed because she had pressed it 2 nights ago. She braided her hair and pinned it. She looked in the small square mirror above the washstand and saw a woman who looked tired and capable and not particularly frightened, which was not entirely true, but was close enough to work with. In the kitchen, she built up the fire and heated water and made the strong coffee she allowed herself on days when she needed to think hard. She drank it standing at the window. Outside, the valley was white with frost, the 2 ridges of pale stone barely visible in the early dark. It was beautiful in a hard, indifferent way. She had always loved this valley. She intended to stay in it. By the time the children were up, she had their breakfast on the table, cornmeal with the last of the molasses. And she had told them what she was doing today in plain terms, because she had decided early that her children would know what was happening in their own lives. She told them she was going to the bank to speak to Mr. Cree. She told them she had saved enough to make an offer she believed he would accept. She told them she did not know for certain how it would go, but she was going, and she needed them to go to school and be steady. Fern asked what would happen if Cree said no. Della said she had thought about that and had a next step. Cass asked what the next step was. She said she hoped it wouldn't come to that. Cass nodded. Fern folded her hands on the table and said she had been writing down their egg income for 6 weeks, and the total was $6.40, and it was Della's to use. Della looked at her 9-year-old across the cornmeal and felt the thing in her chest that she could not name. She walked into town at 8 o'clock. The streets were not busy yet. A few men at the livery, smoke from the hotel kitchen, a dog crossing the road in no hurry. She passed Mrs. Aldridge on the boardwalk. Mrs. Aldridge looked at her left hand, looked at her face, and then said, "Good morning." It was the first direct word the woman had spoken to her in 2 months. Della said good morning back and kept walking. She passed Velda Pratt's husband at the mercantile doorway, and he tipped his hat with an expression of vague discomfort, and she nodded and kept walking. The town was watching. It was always watching. She had long ago stopped performing for it. The bank opened at 8:30. She was standing at the door when Harlan Cree's clerk turned the lock. She walked in. She asked to see Mr. Cree. The clerk, young, nervous, aware of who she was and why she was here, went to the back office and knocked. She stood in the center of the bank's main room and did not look at the floor and did not look at the door and did not fidget with her hands. She looked at the wall directly ahead of her, at the printed bank charter mounted in a frame. She read the language of it. She waited. The door opened. Harlan Cree stood in the doorway of his office and looked at her across the room, and she looked back at him, and neither of them spoke for a moment. Then he gestured, and she walked in, and the door closed behind her. Harlan Cree was 48 years old, clean-shaven, with the kind of face that had probably been handsome once, and had settled into authority instead. He dressed well. He had on his desk an oil lamp, a ledger, a pen, and a glass paperweight in the shape of a sphere, through which the light bent in a small oval on the leather surface. He gestured to the chair across from his and sat himself behind the desk and folded his hands and waited. He had learned, Della imagined, that waiting made people nervous. She sat down. She did not wait. She opened with the amount she had. She laid the coins on the table in a pouch. She had not counted them into neat stacks, because neat stacks were a performance of deference, and she was not here to perform. She told him the amount. She told him it represented 8 weeks of work at every avenue available to her. She told him it was not the full debt. She told him it was also not nothing, and that he was a businessman. And as a businessman, he knew that something was worth more than nothing, and that a forced sale of her house and land would take months to resolve, cost legal fees, and make him unpopular in a town that already had opinions. She said she was proposing a payment of this amount now, a written extension of 60 days for the remainder, and that she would present him with a written plan. She slid the paper across his desk, the one she had prepared, with income projections and a schedule. Within 1 week. She stopped talking. She folded her hands. She waited. Cree looked at the pouch. He looked at the paper. He picked it up. He read it, and she watched his face and saw that he was actually reading it, not performing reading, and that the numbers made sense to him, because she had made sure they made sense to anyone who understood basic arithmetic. He set it down. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, and this was the moment she had been building toward for 8 weeks. He said the amount was short. She said she knew. He said the extension was unusual. She said she knew that, too. He said the bank was not in the business of charity. She said she wasn't asking for charity. She was asking for 60 days at standard interest, on an account that had already demonstrated 8 weeks of consistent good faith payment in the form of everything she had sold to bring this amount to his desk. She said she was a woman who kept her word, which was more than she could say about everyone who had ever signed a paper in this bank. And he was welcome to consider the implication of that, as he chose. The room was quiet. The oil lamp hissed faintly. Cree turned the glass paperweight over in one hand, and the light oval on the desk shifted and moved. Della watched him. She was not afraid. She realized, in this moment, that she had not been afraid for some time. Not of him, not of this room, not of this outcome. She was tired, and she was determined, and she was very clear about who she was and what she had done to arrive in this chair. If he said no, she had a next step. She had written it on the paper she had not shown him, the other paper at home. But she did not think he would say no. He said yes. He said 60 days standard interest, with the plan submitted in writing within the week. He said if she missed the deadline, he would proceed without further courtesy. She said she understood. He called his clerk in and had a document drawn up. They both signed it. She took her copy, folded it, and placed it in her coat pocket, next to the place where her wedding ring used to be. She stood up. She did not thank him effusively. She thanked him briefly and professionally, the way a businesswoman thanks a bank. He watched her from behind his desk as she walked to the door. She opened it. Then, because she was a human being and not a stone, she allowed herself one breath, one full, private breath, before she stepped out into the bank's main room, where the clerk was pretending to write and definitely listening, and walked through the front door and out into the winter street. The sky was white. The frost had not lifted. The main street of Caldwell Flats lay ahead of her, and somewhere on it were people who had called her shameless and turned their faces away and decided what her survival looked like from the outside. She stood on the boardwalk in front of the bank and looked at the street and thought about all of it. Then she thought about Cass at the woodpile, and Fern with her notebook, and Bertie pressing her face into her coat in the dark, and she started walking home. She told the children that evening. All 3 of them were at the table, which was not always possible to arrange, and she laid the signed document in the center and let them look at it. Bertie asked what it was. Fern said it was a paper that meant they were staying. Cass looked at it for a long time without speaking. Then he looked at Della and said, in a voice that was trying very hard to be steady, that he knew she had sold her ring. She said yes, he said he had. Found the mark on her finger that morning when she was making breakfast. She said she had wondered if he noticed. He said he wanted, when he was older, to give her something to put back on that finger. She looked at her son across the table. 12 years old, lean and serious and entirely too old in some ways and entirely a child in others. And she told him she was going to tell him something important, which was that what she had done this fall did not need to be replaced or repaid. It was not a sacrifice to be made good. It was something she had done because it needed doing, and she was the one to do it. And that was all. He could honor it by living well. That was sufficient. Fern asked what happened next. Della told her about the 60-day extension and the plan and the income projections. Fern listened with her hands folded in her characteristic way and then asked if she could see the projections. Della showed her. Fern studied them. She pointed to the egg income line, which Della had included, and said the number was slightly low because she had started selling to a second customer last week and had not told Della yet because she wanted to wait until it was consistent. Della looked at the revised number. She said it helped. Fern said she knew. In the weeks that followed, the plan held. Not perfectly, nothing holds perfectly, but with the solidity of something built from real work and real calculation. The 60-day extension passed with a second payment made on time. By March, the debt was reduced to a figure she could manage through a full spring of regular work. The land was still hers. The house was still hers. The children were still hers. Spring came late that year, the way it did in that valley, reluctantly, by degrees, the creek thawing in stages, the ground going from iron-hard to soft, in a slow progression that Della watched from the kitchen window each morning while the coffee heated. The town of Caldwell Flats shifted in the way towns shift when they've been watching someone too closely, and reality has failed to cooperate with the story they were telling. Mrs. Aldridge began saying good morning consistently. Velda Pratt sent a jar of preserves in April, which was acknowledged and not discussed. The school board inquiry had gone nowhere, partly because Miss Aldrin had reportedly said that the Voss children were the 3 most diligent students in her classroom, and that anyone who said otherwise had not been in her classroom. It filtered back. These things always filter back. Della did not pursue any of it. She had no interest in vindication from people who had required the winter's proof to see what had been true all along. On the first warm evening of the year, early April, the ridge stones faintly gold in late light, the air carrying the first real warmth in months. Della sat on the front step while the children played in the yard. Birdie was chasing something, a butterfly or a bird or perhaps nothing, running in a wide, loose circle with her arms out. Fern was on the fence with her notebook, recording something, her dark hair against the light. Cass was at the far end of the property checking the fence line, already, without being asked, because this was who he was now. His thin shape moving against the sky in the slow, careful way of a person learning what it means to be responsible for something. Della watched all 3 of them. She thought about Estelle, and the piano, and the mountain pass. She thought about what it costs to hold on to things that matter, and what it costs to let go of things that don't, and the great difficulty of knowing the difference until you're in the middle of choosing. She thought about all the things she had sold and what was left. Everything was left. Everything that was real. Old Burl Fenwick had told her, 2 weeks after the bank meeting, that the story had gone around town. The real one, not Velda Pratt's version. That people had put it together. The quilts, the iron skillet, the mule, the ring, the laundry work, the egg negotiations run by a 9-year-old. He had told her with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had known all along what kind of person she was and had waited for everyone else to catch up. He said people were calling her stubborn and remarkable in almost the same breath. She had told him she didn't much care what they were calling her. He had laughed. He said he knew. That was why he was telling her. She called the children in for supper as the light off the ridge went from gold to copper to the gray-blue of early evening. Birdie came first, wind-blown and bright-faced, throwing herself against Della's side in the doorway. Fern hopped down from the fence and tucked her notebook under her arm and walked in with the bearing of a small professor. Cass came last, latching the gate carefully behind him, crossing the yard in long strides, stopping to wipe his boots on the step. He was going to be tall. He was going to be steady. She watched him come and thought about the afternoon behind the barn when he had gone to be alone with his grief, and the evening he had come back in with that settled look, and every day since. She thought he was going to be all right. She thought they were all going to be all right. He passed her in the doorway, and she put her hand briefly on his shoulder, and he did not pull away, which was not nothing, which was in fact everything. She stepped inside. The door closed. The supper was on the stove, and the evening was warm, and the house was theirs.